Madrid Design Festival es una satisfacción poder contar cada año con grandes, interesantes y pequeñas, pero sobre todo cualitativas experiencias profesionales. Nos fijamos en experiencias individuales, nos fijamos en trabajos de estudios, de equipos, como los que acabamos de poder escuchar en las anteriores charlas, pero con los premios realmente también intentamos poder acercar diferentes aproximaciones al diseño que vienen de profesionales de ámbitos muy diferentes. Este año con los premios hemos reconocido a un gran diseñador industrial, a una leyenda del diseño como Giorgetto Giugiaro. Hemos tenido también la oportunidad de premiar a dos arquitectos como Nerian Hu, que acaban de estar aquí con nosotros. Y ahora pues vamos a tener la suerte de poder conocer, descubrir o indagar en el planteamiento filosófico y conceptual de un diseñador que mira a la sociedad, que nos enseña con su trabajo a que el diseño, el diseñador, esté atento a todas nuestras necesidades y que en cierto modo actúe con responsabilidad y con conciencia. Yo creo que muchas de las palabras que acabo de decir serán repetidas por Bruno en la siguiente clase, a la cual invito a impartir, así que por favor un aplauso para Bruno Monguzzi.
Thank you. Is this working? So, besides obviously thanking you for inviting me here and telling you that obviously I'm quite honored. I have to say that I assumed a lot of students would be here, and my talk, it's fundamentally for them. As far as I'm concerned, two magic things just happened since I arrived in Madrid. The first was that I received the prize on the Darwin Day. And I don't know if it was an accident, if it happened by chance, but to me, it's a very meaningful thing. And the other kind of miracle is that the organizer has asked me to talk to you today, which is the Love Day. And they probably sensed or knew, I don't know, I didn't mention that the first problem I was going to bring up for students, it's that if they want to be designers, and if they are here, I guess that that's what they want, the will of a designer is to get in love with the problem, not with himself, which is very beautiful because our life is a continuous love affair. Each new problem that you assume, it's a love story. So, let's start. When my mother, it was the summer of 1941, at the very tip of southern Switzerland, finally decided to show the light to me. It was beautiful, I was told, early morning. My father was still Italian. He was going to be naturalized, as they said. I think it's a strange word to be used, but anyway, that's the proper word. I checked. In English, it's the same. Imagine, he was going to be naturalized Swiss few years later. But when I was born, he was Italian. So this is to say to the Swiss cultural ambassador who is here that I am a Swiss bastard. My mother was Swiss from the beginning. And of course, my father and my mother were extremely different one another. And my brother was, I mean, terrible brother to have because he was damn good at everything. And I was I was the wrong child. I was the naughty one. Anyway, as a child, I never stopped asking why, even in school. I was never, stopping to ask questions. And as a young man, I had a dream to change, of course, the world. I grew up, of course, is a way of saying, between two completely different conceptions of the world. The one of my mother, a kind of proto-liberal Catholic, and the one of my father, a kind of heterosocial kind of Marxist. Of course, I dreamed to change the world, as I was saying, first with a pencil, and more or less at the same time, a year later, with a fist. But eventually, as any common man, I was changed by the world. But it is probably due to these two crossing forms of moralism that the search for sense became for me a natural need, and then my father and my mother, unaware, became my first masters. She had the extraordinary humility not to understand when there was nothing to be understood. I would therefore go back to my drafting table and start all over again. My father, a craftsman, loved with his hands, with his eyes, with his mind everything he would do, and would never stop until perfection, according to him, was achieved. Of course, I attended a Swiss design school, was a diligent student, acquired a good hand, rather good hand, was confronted with a few dogmas and several private gospels, and had to discover, at my own expense, that even in Switzerland, a graphic design course could have little to do with communication. Most of my why were unanswered, and for a kid in search of the universal language, this became too frustrating. Therefore, I quit Switzerland and moved to London. And I became very involved in the study of visual perception. It is there in 1960 that I also began to study the typography of the avant-garde movements around the 20s, and that my eyes began to grasp the meanings beyond the look. It is there that the thick skin of an allegedly brilliant student began to peel off in a slow, long process still in progress. It is surprising how radical the damage of a formalistic education can be. You learn a so-called style, you ignore the message, the scope, the receiver. The umbilical cord that links the eye to the brain and the brain to your hand may be irreversibly cut then, before you're even born, I mean professionally. It is in London that I began to make a non-dogmatic distinction between objective and expressive typography. It is there that I stopped worrying about objectivity versus subjectivity and began to worry about appropriateness and relevance. For me, the objective typography and functional typography were not necessarily synonymous anymore. It is still in London that in the second issue of Diseñador Graphique magazine, I was struck by the works of the Milanese Studio Boggeri, a design office that was actually run by a musician. I had to meet this man. It was really a need. Precisely because he was not a graphic designer. The day I was 20, I flew to Milan. The elevator of Piazza 2-3 was tiny, slow, and a bit kind of shaky. During the long ascent to the 5th floor, I felt a bit uneasy, and this sensation had to last for the following 2 years. The first week have been very difficult. I used to work also at home at night, over the weekends, trying desperately to be good enough to be kept there. One morning, unexpectedly, I was called into his room. Lowering his thin face, he was very, very tall, and lifting his long hands, the most beautiful hands I've ever touched in my life, he began to talk about spiders' webs, all kind of spiders' web. Of course, I thought that this was a very strange introduction to fire me. I was very nervous. He went on and on, at least so it seemed to me, he went on for quite some time. But finally, he mentioned that Swiss graphic design was often as perfect as any of the spider webs he said we have been talking about. I mean, he was talking about. But at times of a useless perfection. The web, he stated, becomes useful when a fly disrupts it. So I want to make sure that you get the point, because unfortunately, my experience tells me that a lot of graphic designers don't get the point. The point is that the fly is the nourishment. The fly is the substance, not the web. It is so, upon Boggeri's instigation, that began for me the slow, long, difficult hunt in the sterilized universe of a Swiss education for an improbable fly. Sitting in front of me, behind very thick glasses, and in the midst of a permanent basing, Aldo Calabresi was working quietly. He, so myopic, would never miss a shot. A great designer. He was so great that he stopped very soon. He went on an island and didn't care about design anymore. As you probably know, at one point, around the 60s, everything kind of began to collapse in Italy. It is because of him that a little fly or two began to fly around me too, infringing at last my painstakingly constructed web. Now, leaving to the Freudians, the broken grid, apparently, the identity that I've been trying to achieve in my work ever since is connected to this little triangle of Swiss land invading Italian soil where I was born, where people seem too Italian to be Swiss, but too damn Swiss to be considered truly Italians. You see, I'm a bastard. In 1987, when Heinz Büttler asked me to work on the film titles and on the poster for a documentary he had just filmed in a Jewish home for the elderly outside Vienna, he brought a bunch of photographs that he had taken during the shooting. The title of the film, Was geht mich der Frühling an? What has spring got to do with me? Kind of translation. Was taken from a conversation between Büttler and one of the residents, Frau Arzterball. I therefore kept only the picture she was in, of course, and since no close-up were available, I asked Heinz for the negatives. Picked a frame, blew it up. I just blew up a small portion of one of the negatives and began to work on the framing of her face. Finally, I had the portrait, but not the poster. What I needed was an image that could tell the story, a picture with the strength of a symbol. I went back to the dark room, exposed a strong face, laid a narrow strip of cardboard on two film boxes in order to have a blurred shadow on the sensitive paper. The diagonal strip of this diagonal strip of light crossing her face was now telling a story, her story. Of course, I had to make several attempts. You know, in the dark room, you cannot see very well. And so the position of the little bridge, each time I was trying to move it. So I made, as I said, several attempts. And in order to make a visual statement more cinematic, I picked two. I picked two prints and cropped them slightly differently. See, if you pay attention, you see that it's not the same image. And the cropping, it's different. Words and color now could follow. Words. Let's talk about words. When we use a word, we are actually substituting something with something else. And the word, in fact, is going to represent in one way or another whatever is being substituted. For example, if I say Anna, maybe there are many Annas here, but the Anna I mean is the beautiful daughter of Antonio Boggeri. Some of you may have noticed her. In any case, I am substituting a person, that person, in our full complexity with just 4 letters. I am substituting what the semiologists name the referent with what they name the signifier. The referent being the object or the subject of the communication, in our case, the actual person. Is Anna here? But you're not my Anna. Well, anyway, the actual person, let's suppose you. The signifier being the device I am using, in our case, her name, to communicate the referent to a given interlocutor. And here really lies the problem, how well this is substituting that. A problem, we could say, of transcription. Now, the same word, Anna, as a matter of fact, can tell very different stories. Anna, her father, many, many years ago. Anna, me last night. What is finally communicated, the signified, so for the student, referent, signifier, signified, is not related to the name in itself, but rather to the way in which the name was pronounced. In other words, the how defines the what. According to semiotics, the problem is threefold, having to do with semantics, syntactics, and pragmatics. Semantic, because it deals with the potential meaning of whatever sign you are using. Syntactic, because it deals with our capacity to master the language we are using. Pragmatic, because it deals with our interlocutor's capacity to interpret these languages. Well, since quite a few of you, I assume, are graphic designers, let's make a visual example. Pretty chic. Could be a perfume. Pretty shitty, actually quite disgusting for all of us. not for the fly. Sorry. She's not, doesn't seem to be disgusted at all. And you already have seen it. You know, being Swiss, of course, you have to use Helvetica. But it's pretty aseptic. So, I'm talking to the students. To be very clear, before we start designing, we have to know precisely how shitty our shit should be. We must know the interlocutor and the purpose, the scope, the goal we want to achieve. And just as we naturally adapt our tone of voice, we should be able to define our typographic approach according to the scope, shifting freely from objective to expressive typography. From typography where the formal content tends to fade out as much as possible to get across the message as neutrally as possible, for example, in a train timetable, to typography where the formal content tends to affirm itself immediately, even before we read, to predetermine the meaning, to specify that meaning, or to implement a second meaning, more or less explicit or more or less allusive. It is, first of all, a matter of intelligence. You know, without intelligence, there is no intelligibility. Asking the proper questions is much more difficult than finding the right answers. If the problems differ, the answers are naturally bound to change. I look into the problem in depth, searching for its core, its specificity. It is from that specificity that the answer is generated. Typographic design is simply the vehicle through which words can be seen, read, and understood, hopefully, and possibly memorized. This is what I had answered many years ago to the Japanese editor of the Idea magazine special issue on typography. For Rudy Rueg's book, Basic Typography Design with Letters, I had instead quoted Lisitsky. Typographic design should use visual means in the same way as voice and gesture are used by the speaker to express his message. That's the quote. Typographic design should use visual means in the same way as voice and gesture are used by the speaker in order to express his thought, in order to express the message. And I mentioned that the assimilation of the typographer with the orator seemed to me the most relevant and intelligent provocation for young students, often sidetracked in the maze of fashion beyond the confines of communication. In the summer of 1986, The competition to design the poster for the opening of the new Musée d'Orsay failed. I guess you all know what the Musée d'Orsay is about. Most entries were showing a painting or a detail from a painting. Others were showing the building or a detail from the building. Now, the head of the curators realized that he did not want to see a painting, not even a detail of a painting. He would say, why Manet, not Monet? You know, why Cézanne? The director did not want to see the building, not even a detail from the building. You know, after all, it was a train station. Having designed the logo and the signage myself, but not having entered the competition, I was called to Paris. All was needed was the date and the logo. A striking new brief, unbelievable. And here I am, playing around with the logo and the date and the logo, getting nowhere. Nothing was actually happening. Nothing was opening. Nothing was beginning. You know, just nice kind of graphics. I walked to my photography books, picked a L'Artigue album, and slowly began to go through the pages. When I came over the image of his brother taking off with a glider, I knew I had the answer. The fly had broken the web. 10 days later, on Friday, the 12th of September, at the age of 92, Jacques-Henri L'Artigue died. The poster, 3 meters by 4 meters, became a posthumous homage. Sometimes we have to disobey. Disobey the briefs when they are misleading. It means that you have to read them pretty carefully with a critical mind, with a critical mindset. Disobey the rules when they do not allow to reach the proper goal. Disobey dogmas and trends because they limit the range of the possible solution. Because in fact, they are tearing off pages from the visual dictionary. In the winter of 1974, before designing the catalog, the poster, and the exhibition Mayakovsky, Merkle, Stanislavski, I met 3 ladies that came from Moscow. Since they were mostly talking about Mayakovsky, I suspected that the show should not be divided in 3 equal parts. In fact, I was told, Mayakovsky will require most of the space. What about Stanislavski, I asked? Much, much less. Half of the space devoted to Mayakovsky will be more than enough. And what about Merkle? In between the two, I took note. On the train from Milan to Chiasso, I designed the poster. On the train ticket, at the time, the train ticket was about this size. The 3 major figures of Russian theater being quite different one another, and in order to recollect constructivism, I could only work with 3 independent fields. Black, red, and gray, of course. You have no choice. I knew that Mayakovsky and Stanislavski were really on the opposite sides, you know, from a political standpoint. So I went up with Mayakovsky, and came down with Stanislavski from the corners. You see, I'm not so creative. And then, you know, the thickness was given, and then, you know, I had two corners left. I decided to come down from the top corner. Now, there is a very significant story about this poster that 4 years later, you know, it was 75, in 79, I became part of a very kind of snobbish international designers association. And it was in England. And one of the Swiss gods walks up to me. I imagine he didn't know who I was. Maybe he was going to ask me if I knew where the toilet was. And he says, "Oh, Bruno, I'm so glad to meet you because I have seen your Mayakovsky poster and I think it's a stunning piece." And, you know, he was a god, and so he said, "Oh, I'm so pleased, you know, you liked it." And he said, "But, you know, if I may, can I point out a little thing?" And I said, "Well, of course." He said, "Well, do you remember the space between the black rectangle, the Mayakovsky rectangle, and the Stanislavski rectangle?" I said, Of course, I remember, the tiny little space." He said, "Well, it's a little bit too narrow. It's a bit vibrating." And so I said, "Well, thank you so much for the lesson." I didn't have to pay for it, you know. And I said, "Thank you so much for the lesson." But I questioned since, why should not vibrate a little? This I didn't understand, and I still don't understand. But I mean, maybe for Swiss people, little vibration, it disturbs. Now, some people, I'm sure also here, think that there is only one way to do proper typography. And that this way, in order to have a proper personality, has to conform to a given style. The problem arises when the spectrum of the communication is wider than the eye of your needle. We could correctly name this constructivistic typography. And this chaotic typography. Geometric typography. Kinetic typography. Catastrophic typography. Soviet typography. No, sorry, Russian typography. And Soviet typography. Bauhaus typography. The theater was actually built in 1927 by Karl Weidemeyer, Bauhaus adept, of course. Bauhaus typography, case 1. Bauhaus typography, case 2. Bastard Bauhaus typography, case 1. and Bastard Bauhaus Typography, Case 2. Classic typography. Della pazzia means about madness, about insanity. It's a perpetual problem. Baroque typography. Post-Baroque neoclassic typography. Neoclassic typography. Surrealistic symbolistic typography. Now, for the students that are not yet familiar with surrealism and symbolism, let's call it floating typography. Swiss floating typography. In order to become an indicator, the A should not float too much. Topographic typography. These are all the sites, the galleries in which the exhibition were happening. And now this nice freedom, it's not a nice composition. It's an invisible map. That's where the galleries were located. Peripheral typography. The subtitle of the show was 18 Artists en marge. The text is in Italian, but en marge is a way of saying in French, it means to the margin. Integrated typography. Introspective typography. Objective typography. Directive typography. Quotidiano means daily. The daily. And so, to be specific, I blew up every day the date. The date became the title. And I tagged the day of the week. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. On Monday, no newspaper. Minimal and conceptual typography. Let me explain. The title was The 80s and the 90s in the Panza di Piumo collection. And the collection was dealing, in case you don't know Panza di Piumo, the collection was dealing only with minimal and conceptual art. Could the numbers 80 and 90 be minimal and at the same time conceptual? A minimal approach has to use 1 0 only, since it is common to both numbers. And a minimalistic 0, of course, is a circle. This seemed a very strong visually, it seemed to be very strong. I didn't even have to make a sketch. Huge black circle in the street, but conceptually weak. So I looked the title again from a conceptual standpoint. And we were in 1992 the 80s had completed the cycle, but the 90s were just opening a new one. The answer was again in the zero. Now I had a visible concept. I just sandwich the two. Invisible typography. And let's end with this paradox because I want to leave some time in case you have questions. If not, I will just continue. So let's end with this paradox. The show was on the 20th century photogram. And the title was a poetic title. The title was Anwesenheit by Abwesenheit, the presence of absence. So this suggested to make the text disappear. Actually, the text is there. It will appear while you walk closer to the poster. I could not pick a photogram from the poster. There were two curators, one from Germany, the other from Zurich. And they both believed that if I would pick a Molinari photogram, then people in the street would think, okay, it's a show in the 20s. But if I would pick a contemporary artist photogram, that they would say, oh, this is bullshit, nothing to be understood. You know, so they said, you have to come up with an idea. You cannot use any of the photograms that we are showing. So I made a photogram of my hand holding a clear marble because the light is being concentrated in one point. Now, I wanted my fingers to be blurred because the subject was not my hand, was the light. And so I was trying to move my fingers to blur them, but in moving my finger, I would also move the marble, so I was going crazy. And so, although I am Swiss, I cheated. Instead of touching the marble, I lift up my fingers, and so I could even move these two, and the marble was there. Okay. Question time. If you have questions, if you don't, I will continue to explain some projects. It's finished? No, well, he's saying that the time is finished. Otherwise, you are going to miss the other conference. So I am very grateful, for your attention. I just steal, that's my Italian side, I just steal 1 minute, perhaps not even. The greatest lesson in my life, I was 19. I made a note not to forget. Didn't come from a designer, and Anna is going to be happy because it didn't come from a man. It came from a young French philosopher. Her name is Simone Weil, not the politician, Weil with a W, who died at the age of 34 in London during the La Résistance, during the resistance. a very simple statement shocked me. That was the lesson of my life, the most important. Our method of investigation. Once you have finally embraced a thesis, and in order to do that, you have to give all of yourself. When now you have a thesis, it's not the end, it's the beginning. Because you have to, the task is now to check the opposite idea, the opposite thesis, because there might be some truth in there. So it's the day of love, and this is a lesson of love. If there is no love, there is no understanding. There is just your own stupid dogmas. Not yours, I mean, anyone.